So I did a series of videos on Joe Rogan and a podcast he did with Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey. And I was critical of him because I felt Joe didn't push hard enough on conservatives being censored on Twitter, amongst some other groups as well. And a lot of people shared this frustration, which is why I did these videos. Rogan has recently had Jack Dorsey on the other day with one of Jack Dorsey's lawyers, whose name I can't pronounce, and Tim Pool. Tim Pool's a left-leaning journalist who's someone I really respect, though, because I think he is interested in the ideas of free speech. He's sort of a left-wing libertarian. And so even though we would disagree politically on many things, we're coming from the same place in that we both think that free speech is important, we don't want to see censorship, and we think that constructive dialogue and debate is important even amongst people that disagree. So I wanted to do a video on this because I think it's very important to talk about. Now, why is this important, you may be asking? Who is Joe Rogan? Joe Rogan's just some guy who does UFC, right? He's like an MMA guy who was a stand-up comedian. But aside from all that, Joe Rogan's part of what's now being called the intellectual dark web. And what this are is people that are online that may have vastly different political beliefs, but they're all under the banner of free speech, of debate, of not censoring people, and they all understand the problem that I talk about often, which is this. All of our cultural institutions of power are dominated by the establishment Democratic Party. And so by these institutions, I mean academia, the entertainment industry, the mainstream media, and now even we see Silicon Valley. So if you're a conservative, it's hard to have a voice anywhere in culture. So where we do see that occurring is social media. But increasingly, there are attempts on several social media platforms to censor or to get rid of these conservative viewpoints, which is a very dangerous thing. Because if you take an entire group of people, maybe 50% of this country, and tell them they no longer have a voice anywhere, and they're terrible people, and they can't have an open dialogue or debate because they're just horrible people, bad things are going to happen. That's why the First Amendment is the First Amendment. It's one of our most important rights, the right to have free speech, to have dialogue, to have debate, to have constructive criticism. When we silence that and we just say, no, you're a bad person, you don't have the right to speak anywhere, very bad things will happen. So that's why it's important to defend things like this. It's important to talk about censorship on areas like Twitter. And it was important to call out Joe Rogan because he's one of these free speech advocates that seem to drop the ball. So let me start by saying I applaud Joe Rogan completely. He did exactly what I suggested in the last video where I talked about this, where I said what he should do is have someone who's sort of more of an expert on him on these cases of Twitter censoring conservatives and other people, and have them come on and talk to Jack Dorsey. I don't have a problem that Dorsey brought a lawyer on that knows more than him about these specific issues so that we could have more of a chance to get to the specific nuance of what each situation was about. I thought Tim Pool, again, not someone I agree with politically on a lot of issues, but we do have sort of a libertarian feel, and definitely we both support the First Amendment, and we're against the ideas of censorship. I thought he did a fantastic job. He's one of my favorite people online. I really appreciate him because he's someone that, like me, I try to model myself to do this as well. Even if we're genuine people, we have integrity, and so even if someone that shares our political ideological beliefs does something we deem wrong, we will say, yeah, we think that's wrong. And he, as someone who's left-leaning, is always coming to conservatives' defense saying, why are these conservatives being kicked off of these different platforms, particularly on Twitter? And so I thought he was the perfect type of person to have on. Granted, he wasn't a conservative, but it almost seems more impactful to have someone who's not a conservative saying, and I'm appalled at what's happening to these conservatives. So I thought he did a fantastic job. He came off as respectful, but he was impassioned, and that's something that I try to do as well. He wasn't calling people names. He didn't call Dorsey or his lawyer names, but he said, I disagree with you. And let me tell you, one of the hardest things to do in the world, it has sit in front of someone who's trying to sound reasonable like Jack was and saying, oh yeah, we understand their problems, we'll get to the bottom of it, and to not just be like, oh, that's great of you to say. Because at the end of the day at this, Tim Pool still said, I hear what you're saying, and I still think that what your company's doing is terrible, and I think it's a huge danger. And I don't think anything's going to change for the positive unless there's some sort of government intervention. So kudos to Tim Pool for doing his research, for being respectful, for being impassioned, and for not buying into the lies just in this cult of personality while he was sitting there. I thought it was fantastic. So let's talk about some of the specific issues that we're talking about. Oh, and I guess I should say kudos to Joe Rogan also for knowing that he let him control most of the conversation, and he pushed back on both sides when he felt was necessary. So any criticism I had of Joe for his initial interview with Dorsey, which I still think was not a good interview and was a huge mistake, I'm willing to overlook at this point because I think he did exactly the right thing here. I'm not saying I'm overlooking it because he agrees with me entirely. He doesn't. He still defends Dorsey on issues that I wouldn't, but he did the right thing. He allowed both sides to come on and say their piece, and he had people that were kind of the relevant people on both sides of the issues come on. So kudos to Joe Rogan. I have a lot of respect for that, and It doesn't mean I feel my initial criticism was unwarranted, but he did the right thing here. So let's talk about some of the specific issues. First, there's a question. In addition, I'll link the video. In addition to this, then Tim Pool went on to talk about this interview on the Dave Rubin show. Who Dave Rubin's another person I like, who's kind of more bent to the left wing. We might not agree with all political issues, but again, he's someone I really like. That's all about debate, First Amendment, free speech, and things like that. So I watched both of those videos. I'll link both below, and this is where I'm getting my impressions of what's going on. So the first is the question of, is Dorsey someone who believes what he's saying? Is he ideologically just like malevolent, and he just, to heck with conservatives, to heck with non-establishment Democratic beliefs? I don't believe so. My reading of him as a person, and from listening to Tim Pool talk and even Joe Rogan, I think he comes off as genuine. I think he doesn't realize that he's surrounded by people that are making these decisions that make Twitter come off as biased and having a double standard. And here's what I mean by this. You can have all the codes. This is the true of any online platform or anything that has moderators or things like that, whether it be a blog site, it be somewhere like YouTube, Twitter. At the end of the day, no matter what your terms of service are, it comes down to a human having some sort of judgment. And so you, as a human that works at Twitter, will eventually get the complaint, have to look at this case and say, does this violate our terms of service? And there's several ways that a human could do that. You could look at the terms of service in the most literal sense and say, does this literally violate the letter of the law that we've written down? Or you could say something like, does it violate the spirit of the law we laid down? So, for example, Jack Dorsey himself mentions in this, you might have someone threatening death and be like, can't wait to kill, Rob tomorrow. But what they're referencing is, we're going to play some video game. We're playing Halo tomorrow. And that's what the reference was. So this, even though technically that would violate the terms of service because you made a threat to someone, the spirit of it is, they're clearly just jesting and they're playing a game. Therefore, we're not going to say that that was a violation. And so there's human involvement. The problem with Twitter and all of these other institutions is, where are all these humans coming from politically? Well, we know almost all of them are ideologues of the left, particularly the mainstream establishment Democratic Party. And that means that's the lens they're going to view everything through. So what happens is, we can see that Dorsey's lawyer is able to come on here constantly and say, each individual case, why was Alex Jones banned? Why was Sargon of Akkad banned? All of these people. They could look at those and say, well, here's exactly why, because these violate the terms of service. But then when Tim says, okay, so we have these 3 incidents of Sargon, for example, where you say these 3 issues were why he ultimately got banned. But I could take someone like blue checkmarked verified people on Twitter that over and over, 3, 4, 5 times were saying, if you see the Covington kids, fire on them, lock them in a school and light the school on fire, basically threatening death to children, which is way worse than anything Sargon or Alex Jones did. And they're doing it multiple times. Why weren't they banned? And it's, well, we used our judgment looking at the context to say we removed those tweets and we had a temporary suspension, but we didn't think it was bad enough. And this is what you see. This happens over and over and over again. It's not the one, and Tim does an excellent job where he talks about, it's like snowflakes in an avalanche. It's not each individual situation is just one snowflake and it's piling up. Or what happens is that one snowflake's not the worst thing in the world. Oh, Alex Jones got banned. Okay, one person, no big deal. Oh, Sargon banned. Okay, no big deal. And Laura Loomer got banned, or whoever. Over and over. But what we see is this is always going as harsh as possible on one side, which was the conservatives or people against the establishment Democratic Party, and always as forgiving as possible on the other side. So the Kathy Griffins or the establishment Democrat people that are threatening death on kids or doxing, they're given the benefit of the doubt. And this happens over and over to where it starts to be a double standard and bias. Jack might not realize it. He might just say, well, hey, I'm looking at the terms of service and yeah, Alex Jones violated him, clear-cut case. But what about Kathy Griffin? Oh, okay, that was a mistake. What about this person that threatened death? Oh, okay, that was a mistake. What about this? Oh, that was a mistake. And I don't know that Jack realizes that the people he surrounded himself with are using this ideologically. They're attacking, whether they're intentionally doing it or not, they're going after people through an ideological lens, where they're allowing people that agree with them ideologically to get away with stuff that they're going hard after people they disagree with ideologically. And that's creating a huge problem, because the other part with the snowflake metaphor is it's not just Twitter. This is happening on every social media platform, where conservatives are gone after hard, establishment Democrats are gone after as light as possible. And it's happening in all of our other cultural institutions, such as academia, such as the mainstream media. such as the entertainment industry. And so what we see is this mountain, each individual situation that we constantly see censoring conservatives, going after them as hard as possible, and going after the establishment Democrats as easy as possible, creates a hugely unbalanced system. This is particularly important because we have Jack Dorsey admitting that Twitter is the new private public square. So imagine there's nowhere left for conservatives to have this viewpoint, to be able to talk. Even on Twitter now, they're being censored like this. And I think that that's really the danger that we're talking about here. That's why it's important. That's why I agree with Tim Pool where he talks about we need to have some sort of regulation or some sort of internet bill of rights that says you can't kick people off just for their political bent. And that's exactly what we see occurring here. So that's one of the things we need to stop. Now, some of the specific issues that I think it was worth talking about that we can get more in depth. Alex Jones particularly getting banned off Twitter. So they read the tweets as the reason he got banned off. One was a video of a child being pushed down, and apparently he said he didn't think it was that big of a deal. I have no idea what's going on with that. But as Joe Rogan correctly says, how many times did you see on Twitter that footage of the guy who just knocks out this 12-year-old girl, throws his haymaker? It was crazy. That's violence. And so it seems arbitrary when you put up a video that shows some sort of violence, what they allow and what they don't allow. Because oftentimes if a media outlet puts footage of someone jumping a person or a kid, for example, that's okay. That's considered newsworthy. But if I do it because I'm not part of the mainstream news, now all of a sudden I could get knocked for, I put up something that's violence. Even if and there's been examples of people reposting images or stories from the mainstream media and actually getting struck for it because they say, no, that's too violent, even though it wasn't violence when the mainstream media did. But what I really want to focus on with Alex Jones is the second strike that he got, which is where he gave this speech, and it is hyperbolic, and I think it's dangerous, where he's talking about the time to rise up is coming, and we need to do so legally and illegally. Basically, arm yourself. The government's a tyranny. I could see why Twitter wouldn't like something like that, and that makes sense, okay? So they struck him for that. My question is, why the double standard then when it comes to liberals, particularly blue checkmark verified Twitter users, not just random people, verified people, when they're talking about violence against Trump or Trump supporters? So CNN could say wearing a MAGA hat is like wearing a Klan hood and something needs to be done about the people that do this. Or you could say that you're going to have the Madonnas of the world saying things like, I've thought about bombing the White House because Trump, or we need to commit violence against Trump, or we need to punch these people because they're Nazis, etc., etc. That's all allowed. That stuff flies all the time. So why is it, now what they'll say in defense of this, and you hear Jack and his lawyer saying this is, but we're not focused on violence overarchingly. We're focused on targeted violence. So if you specifically say to someone, hey, I want to attack you, then that's targeted violence and that's worthy of being struck. But if you just say violence in general, maybe that wouldn't be struck. Then why was Alex Jones struck? He wasn't talking about violence against a specific person. It wasn't like he was tweeting one person and saying, we're coming for you. He was saying, in general, we may need to arm ourselves and have a violent revolution. Again, that's not something I agree with. That's not the type of language I use. But if that's not allowed, why is the language allowed on the other hand? And you could start to see the double standard. So it's okay to come after Trump with that violence. It's okay to say people supporting Trump are horrible Nazis, etc. That's perfectly fine because it's in general. It's not directed specifically at one person. But when Alex Jones talks about, in general, the evils of the government and the need to fight back, that's not acceptable. So you can see right there already their double standard. Sargon of Akkad, his real name's Carl Benjamin. He's someone who's basically a classic liberal, kind of like a libertarian person. Yes, he said provocative stuff, which I won't deny. They read the tweets that he got struck for. The first one was him saying, here's a list of stuff that aren't considered hate speech under Twitter's terms of service. And it was basically like, you can make all kinds of racial slurs to white people or the men, or threats to call people Nazis or threats to attack them. And he lists a bunch of actual tweets that weren't, or things in actual tweets that were never suspended. And he's saying, look, Twitter has no problem with all this stuff. Twitter ironically proves his point by saying, because his point is there's a double standard. Twitter actually strikes him for posting the things that they didn't strike when other people said them, which right off the bat shows the double standard. Even Dorsey's lawyers because Tim Pool and Joe Rogan are like, whoa, he's not attacking someone with this. He's criticizing the rules. So why should he be get a strike for this? And even her, she's like, eh. So this is the problem. They keep saying, well, it's a context. It's something that happened over and over again. So they give 3 examples of Carl Benjamin, or Sargon of Akkad as he goes by. But they admit right out of the gate, well, one of them wasn't as bad as, okay, so are you going to reinstate him? You now realize, oh, well, this is different. Now look at how that's different. Look at how that treatment against him is different than someone such as Kathy Griffin. Now, for her, they give the benefit of the doubt. They say, oh, we have to look at it in the context of the whole situation. Well, what are you talking about? The context where children were getting death threats and were being doxxed, and their school had to be shut down for at least one day, possibly two, because law enforcement said they were credible threats. And in that context, Kathy Griffin's calling for names, specifically says, by the way, oh, they were like, well, we didn't view that as doxing. We thought that, it wasn't specifically doxing. She actually says in the second sentence of that tweet, if you think these kids wouldn't dox you, you got another thing coming. So she's admitting that this is a form of doxing to her. And we know in context that these kids are receiving death threats, but she's allowed to do it. So they look at that and they look at this. They're like, well, we have to look at the context surrounding it. So she wasn't actually calling for doxing, which is garbage. She was. But with Carl Benjamin, they're like, oh, well, we didn't look at the context. We just looked at the specific words. He used bad words, and so therefore he got a strike for it. And that's kind of, again, the double standard that you see. This isn't just one or two times. This is over and over and over and over again. So the next example is Learn to Code. And for those of you that don't know, Learn to Code, if you watch the video, they kind of spell this out. But what was going on was you had a bunch of coal miners and people that were in industries such as that are losing jobs as we kind of switched in less fossil fuel industries and things like that. And so all these media outlets started saying, and it wasn't, I don't know that they realized how condescending they sounded, but they were saying, oh, perhaps this 50-year-old out-of-work coal miner now could go to San Francisco and learn to be a computer coder, which is, they don't understand how condescending and how upset that would make you if you're a coal miner. Like, are you kidding me? You want me just to pick up, totally move my life at 50 years old, change my career, learn about computers, which you probably have very little understanding of, to the point where you could code and have a job in it? It's condescending, and it shows this kind of elitism from the media, where they're just like, oh, well, if people lose their jobs, there's other opportunities. Okay, fine. Then, when all these media people start to get laid off, people respond by saying, hey, learn to code. Hashtag learn to code. That's what you told the coal miners. And now Twitter is actually banning people or striking them because that's considered targeted harassment and offensive, which is ridiculous. It again shows the double standard. When the media tells coal miners, hey, learn to code, it's no problem. But when someone tells a media member, hey, learn to code, then that's considered targeted harassment. Now, you might say, well, it's because it was geared towards a specific person. But these aren't random people. These are people that are verified Twitter users who are in the public persona. Of course, people are going to criticize them. If that's harassment telling them learn to code, then is it harassment when people attack Donald Trump, who's also a public persona? Of course not. We say, hey, that's what you get. You're in the public life. People are going to make fun of you. They're going to insult you. Yet that's allowed to fly. But learn to code to these media people, that's not allowed to fly. And what Dorsey's lawyer talks about is, well, but there were all these people saying learn to code that were also then issuing death threats. Well, why should I then, if I didn't issue any sort of threat and I had no knowledge of that going on, why should I then be struck as being in cahoots with people that were making threats by just saying learn to code? It's a joke. It's a meme. It's pointing out, it's fighting the power. It's pointing out that this elitism's a bad thing that we see happening in the mainstream media. But Twitter says, no, you can't do that. And ironically, and this is something that Tim Pool's trying to point out over and over again, that they're just not grasping, constantly when these situations happen, we have people from CNN, from the New York Times, from other mainstream outlets that are saying, oh, this is harassment. Twitter needs to step in and do something. And then the next day, Twitter steps in and does something. So when the mainstream media says, oh, here's a bunch of examples of why Alex Jones should be banned, and then the next day, Twitter bans them, and Dorsey's like, no, we don't take involvement from the media. That's not true. Whether they're doing it consciously, which I believe it is consciously, or unconsciously, they are listening to what these people are reporting on and then investigating and saying, yeah, okay, we agree with them. We're going to do this. So now we have Twitter protecting the mainstream media, the powerful people, against the people that don't have this power. And it's just ridiculous. So there are protected classes that you can't criticize or insult in certain ways because that's deemed offensive based on what other people that you're not connected to say. Would we say the same thing? Well, the Covington kids were getting death threats. While people were they would say they're terrible people and here's a death threat. So does that mean anyone who said, hey, the Covington kids are terrible people were also issuing threats and they should also be suspended? They should be connected to the people that were making threats? Of course not. And the lawyer for Twitter here, she's like, oh, but we had to, we were worried about threats of violence and we had to step in because we were worried. So they're more worried about public media people who have most of them engaged in back and forth and, issued some sort of insults or criticisms themselves on Twitter They're more concerned about protecting them than they are from actual children who are being given death threats by verified Twitter users to the point where their school actually had to shut down. Do you see the double standard? And they don't even get it here. Every time they're caught in this, they just say, oh, well, context matters. Yes, I agree. These kids were getting death threats. Their school had to shut down. Or they'll say, oh, oops, we made a mistake there. How many times is a mistake going to occur before it's a pattern and it's willful? And I think it's evident that that's what's occurring here. So we talked about the Covington. Another issue that came up was Proud Boys versus Antifa. For those of you who don't know, Antifa is this violent, they claim to be anarchists, they claim to be against fascism, but in reality, they're a fascist group. They use violence and intimidation to try to censor people, to attack people that have different ideologies than them. They're thugs, they're bullies, they're criminals, most of them. And they use intimidation and violence to get their way. The Proud Boys basically started as a joke and then became a response to Antifa where they said, and I'm against this, but they said, we'll meet violence with violence. We're going to show up at a rally where we know Antifa's going to be, so they'll show up to defend conservative speakers having some sort of parade or rally, and they know Antifa will show up, and then they fight with Antifa. Well, for some reason, the entire Proud Boys organization gets banned from Twitter. Okay, because they're violent, fine. But the violent organization that's just as violent, if not more, in my articulation more, of Antifa, they're allowed to stay. And the reason that is given is, well, Antifa is not as top down as the Proud Boys were. But that's not true at all. The Proud Boys operated in a very similar way. Yes, there were people that were supposedly the leaders that started the movement. But in reality, they each had individual branches of place to place. It would be like me. I'm a member of the Fraternal Orders of the Eagles. If my Eagles in my town does something terrible and Twitter says, okay, this Eagles account is banned, does that mean all Eagles accounts are banned? I don't think so, but that's what they did with the Proud Boys. They said, we will judge each individual account based on the actions of what we saw occur outside of Twitter because this whole organization is violent. But they won't do that with Antifa. So it's almost like, well, this Antifa group in Portland, okay, maybe they're bad, so their specific account maybe will do something too. But this Antifa group in D.C., we haven't seen any proof of them committing violence, therefore we won't ban them. But you could say the same of the Proud Boys. There were tons of people involved in the Proud Boys or Proud Boys local chapters that weren't directly involved in violence. So why should they get banned when the whole organization does? Again, it shows another double standard. And we see this double standard again echoing the mainstream media and all these other cultural institutions of power. That's the main problem. All of these institutions work together and they're all coming from the same direction, saying, get rid of conservative voices. They're all, and even not just conservative voices, though that's clearly the bulk of it. Also, like anti-war left-wing people are the target of this type of thing. And so it's a monopoly on influence in culture by all of these mainstream media, the entertainment industry, the academia, and now we see places like Twitter and social media, places like that. And this monopoly is going to lead to very bad things. It's what's leading to the tribalism. It's what's leading to the fracturing. And as Tim Pool says, eventually it could come to violence, like regular violence and almost like sort of a soft civil war because we're breaking up. We're saying this group of people, only the establishment Democrats are allowed to have influence. Everyone else, shut up. You know, you don't get to be involved. And we can see that again with the Proud Boys and Antifa. And the last thing, Tim Pool does bring this up in his interview with Dave Rubin. Someone asked him the question, but why wasn't Louis Farrakhan talked about? And this is a very good point. Louis Farrakhan is the leader of the Nation of Islam, that people like Obama, people like Keith Ellison, many people in the Democratic Party have palled around with. And he likens Jews to termites. He's always making anti-Semitic comments, anti-white comments, things like that. Yet he's still up on Twitter. And though he may have been taken down by now, I don't know. But he was up for years and years while people were saying, why is this crap allowed to fly? The guy likened Jews to termites like 2 days before this Pittsburgh synagogue shooter. And all the media wants to say, it's Trump, even though that shooter hated Trump because Trump's actually defended Israel more than almost any president before. He actually wanted to move, the capital back to Jerusalem. Recognize Jerusalem as the capital, or embassy, put the embassy in their capital. But Farrakhan was allowed to stay up. Why is that? And again, it's clear why. They won't admit it. It's because they are social justice. They are part of this establishment democratic narrative where it's okay. We only have to worry about the white racist. We only have to worry about everyone. It's the idea of cultural Marxism, which I talk about this often, which humorously I'm told by people and my friends on the left, it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. Yet we see examples of it every day. And so the idea is this, just to break down real quick, that You're not an individual. You're just the groups you are, the immutable group. So I'm not Rob, the individual. I am white. I am male. Those both, and you take these categories and they're either oppressor or oppressed. White and male both happen to be oppressors. I'm overweight, so that would make me oppressed, I guess. Not my own fat fault for eating too much. I guess I'm oppressed. This is the sort of ridiculousness we see. And Twitter, the people around Twitter, even if not Dorsey himself, are buying into this. And so they say, oh, we can forgive Farrakhan. Oh, we can forgive Kathy Griffin because they're going after the oppressors. Oh, the media people, we can forgive them. We can forgive the people that threatened to kill the Covington kids. We can forgive all this because they're in oppressed groups. Now, the oppressors we go after as strong as possible. And that's the problem. Yes, they can go through like a lawyer and say, but according to our terms of service, these people we kicked off actually did break the rules. The problem is you're like, okay, just enforce the rules equally. This, by the way, is the exact same thing I'm saying that's the problem with the intel community and our investigative agencies. I don't care if they're going to bust Paul Manafort for failing to register as a foreign lobbyist. Fine. That's great. We need to get foreign influence out of our country. What bothers me is they only do that to people connected to Trump. So the Podesta group that's connected to Hillary that was named in the very indictment as working with Manafort with the very same foreign interests, they don't get charged. And we know that this is hundreds of people, hundreds of lobbyists in Washington are working on foreign agents' behalf that don't file under the proper laws, the FARA laws. Yet they're never arrested. It was just when someone connected to Trump went after him. It's the double standards that enrage you, that show that we don't have an equal system. If Twitter wants to apply things equally and say, hey, we think that any of this talk is bad, that's fine. But they don't. They are humans that are ultimately making this judgment, humans that have an ideology, and those that share their ideology with this cultural Marxism and the establishment democratic narrative, they're more favorable to. And that leads to a system that's unfair for people that aren't in those ideological groups or that are opposed to them. And Tim Pool correctly points out, even the terms of service. Now, they took specifically one group, the trans group, and said, you can't dead name. For those of you that don't know, dead name's when you use the name or the gender of a person before their transition. So if I'm Rob and I transition to being Jill, but you call me Rob on Twitter, that's grounds for you to get kicked off. That's called dead naming because you're insulting me by calling me my prior name. Or if I identify as female now and you say, no, you're a male. Okay, but why do we need a specific rule for that? Harassment's harassment. But there's a specific rule for transgender, and they say, it's because we looked and there's suicide rates amongst transgender. But there's high suicide rates among white males, for example, so does that mean we are going to start banning people that are talking trash on whiteness? Or on males? Of course not. Those are deemed oppressor groups. So that stuff's not, and when Tim Pool brings this up, they're like, well, that could fall under general harassment. Okay, then why couldn't the transgender issue? It's clear that the reason that it was put there was for ideological reasons and to steer a debate. And so we actually see feminists that are actually being kicked off of Twitter, left-wing feminists that are being kicked off because they don't buy into the transgender narrative. And they're like, we're not going to use the pronouns they want us to use. Megan Murphy was her name, I think the one they talk about the most, who her third strike was saying, but women can't be men, or men aren't women, or something like that. Now, granted, it was involved in someone in a specific discussion, but that's a true statement. And when you say no, we will ban these true statements because we find them to be offensive, well, then we've entered the world of 1984. Now, lastly, you might say, but this is a private company. They could do what they want. And you hear this a lot from people that agree with me on a lot of things that are more libertarian, right-wing people. But the problem is, I think that we're starting to see that Twitter is more than that. These social media places are more than that. We see, one, because they are so powerful and so important to the point where even emergency messages from the government that you might need to hear are put on Twitter. We've had court cases saying that Trump can't block people on Twitter because it's people's right to be able to see it because it's a public platform. We know that they're working in conjunction, so chances are if you get banned from Twitter, you not only get banned from there, you're getting banned from Facebook, from YouTube, from Patreon, from PayPal. And so there's this entire... In order to live today, one of the things when I was running for Congress, one of the issues I was running into was in District 12, rural Pennsylvania, where I was running for. Broadband's a huge issue. It's hard to get broadband. And I think that there are credible arguments that broadband at this point should be a utility. Twitter is much in the same vein, and these social media places. because they're so powerful. If you aren't involved in that discussion, you could literally be smeared and maligned. Like we see people like Alex Jones, and you have no voice to defend yourself. The mainstream media is not going to let you on. Academia is not going to leave you on. Entertainment industry won't leave you on. And so you're literally left with these companies are basically monopolies. You can't get involved with them. And so, in my opinion, the fact that they're so powerful, and in fact we had, as Tim Pool correctly points out, we had Democrats going hysterical. It was the biggest deal in the world that supposedly Russian trolls were using some of these platforms, and that could have possibly stolen an election. Okay, well then you're admitting how important these platforms are, and if they're ran by people that are ideologically censoring certain political views, that's way more damage than any Russian trolls could ever do. And it was funny that we see Twitter admitted that Jacob Wall, who kind of trolled and used their platform to spread fake information to help elections, was banned. But the Democrats that admitted to doing the same and pretending Russian bots were influencing Roy Moore in the Alabama election, they were not banned. And they're like, well, we didn't have definitive proof. And it just, again, it goes to show that's how these platforms will be used. And consider this. It's not just that they're that powerful, but then that all of them lean the same direction constantly. They all lean to the establishment Democratic narrative. Imagine where the Republican Party and Donald Trump would be popularity-wise if all of these cultural institutions of power were just 50-50. They actually gave him a fair shake instead of almost entirely being against him and almost entirely being against the Republican Party. And yet still, despite that uphill battle, we still see the Republican Party making inroads. We still see Trump doing okay and having a good chance to win in 2020. So, yeah, I don't buy him with Tim Pool at the end here. I don't buy the excuses. I buy that they could constantly say, well, in this particular issue, we could give you lawyer speak as to why we allowed that to go, but we punished this person. But it's over and over and over and over and over again in the same direction. And it's funny, the left, if you had a police station, for example, that only pulled black people over in a town for jaywalking, and their defense was, but they jaywalked, and you were like, but here's 100 white people that jaywalked. You never pull them over. It's just the black people. And the cops would say, but did not those black people jaywalk? So we were within our rights to arrest them. Now, the leftists we see this because they try to extrapolate racism and everything, even when it's not there. They would say this is outrageous, and I would agree with them. I would say it sounds like there's a problem. 1 or 2 incidents, okay, maybe not a big deal. But hundreds of times, over and over again, with only one certain group of people being targeted, while the other group's treated with the lightest possible touch, it starts to become a pattern. And it's a pattern we don't just see with Twitter, we see all throughout these cultural institutions of power. So that's why it's important to defend this stuff. And thankfully, I think Joe Rogan did a fantastic job setting this up. He's really, I wasn't someone who thought that he was a total sellout, as you can see from my old videos that I did on this. But I did question. I wondered what was going on. And I think he's redeemed himself in this issue in my eyes. And he brought Alex Jones back on, which, like him or hate him, he's entertaining, that's for sure. But he, that was one of the, hey, even someone that insulted him, he let come on and gave a platform for like 4 hours. He brought Tim Pool on to be a strong voice against Dorsey's lawyer. So props off to him, props off to Tim Pool, who I think is fantastic, and everyone should check out his channel. Again, if you're someone that likes me, chances are maybe you lean towards the right. You might not like a lot of Tim Pool's ideological positions. For example, he tends to be a little more, I think he's for eliminating student loan debt. He tends to be more in a slight socialist vein. Things that I disagree with, but he's fantastic. He has integrity. And that's the point. Us people with integrity, regardless of what side we're coming from, the Republican or the Democrat or Green Party or Constitutional Party, we should all stick together on these important issues of free speech. That is what people like Dave Rubin, Tim Pool, Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson, Eric Weinstein, and his brother, whose name's slipping me right now, Brett Weinstein, and tons more are doing. They're saying we could disagree with each other. Sam Harris is another. We could disagree with each other, but we all respect these ideas of free speech. So, yeah, I really enjoyed this podcast. I recommend particularly the Joe Rogan, Dorsey, and Tim Pool podcast to everyone. It is worth watching to see just how slippery the Twitter lawyer is to try to justify what's going on there. And I think it's a real issue that we need to look at because we're starting to see even more of a fracturing of civility and more tribalism. And the more we censor, all of this power starts to censor these particular groups, the more we are likely of seeing that our nation doesn't heal and doesn't work together. And that's a very bad thing. I don't want to see it come to that. So If you like this video, please like and subscribe. I'll be doing a live stream tomorrow around noon, I believe. So check that out. And also, I should be going to be trying to work with some other ventures, which I'll be letting you know about on the channel. But yeah, leave a comment. Leave me any suggestions if you have any for this. And thanks so much for listening, and have a good one.